Great White Silence is 100 years old. It's a fascinating national cultural document, probably the most important film we've got in the National Film Archive. It's the record of Scott's expedition to the South Pole, and it was filmed, as I say, 100 years ago, 1910 to about 1912, by Herbert Ponting, who was the official cinematographer on the expedition. Herbert Ponting was commissioned especially to shoot footage of the expedition. Then, as now, you could get a lot of sponsorship money from the film companies, the burgeoning new newsreel companies, if you brought back pictures from such an exotic location especially. And people were, at that time, polar mad. So every single little thing that Captain Scott was doing was front page news for years. And they would wait with very eager anticipation for any pictures coming back from Antarctica.
When the BFI restores silent films, we're usually working on fiction, so that suggests a certain kind of a score, and traditionally one works with either a piano score, a small band, or up to a full orchestra. Now, looking for how to score a non-fiction film was a really new scenario for us here in the film video distribution department. So we started with the nature of what is the Great White Silence. Really looked at it and knew immediately that you couldn't have the kind of humanistic sounds of piano and bands or even orchestra. It just wouldn't work for this kind of film. You wanted something quite ethereal, and immediately Simon Fisher-Turner's music came to mind to us.
The phone call, the doomed phone call from Jane Giles, who I've known for a long time. She phoned up. Hadn't heard from her for years, and she phoned up. She said, would you be interested in doing, some music for a silent film about Scott in the Antarctic? My mind went, boarding school, heroes, Scott in the Antarctic, wonderful film, yes! After getting the commission, I'd said, yes, I'd love to do it. I hadn't seen the film. I had no idea that it was nearly 2 hours long. And of course, silent is really silent. There's nothing there, there's nothing to help you, there's no reference to sound at all. And it became obvious pretty quickly once I'd seen the film that it was a fairly terrifying task to take on, to tell you the truth. You have to start somewhere, but no, I realised pretty early on that it would have to be very new and contemporary, and I just had to sort of try things out and see whether they worked. And the first thing I had to do, of course, is really try and get to grips with the film and actually figure out how to do it, what it all meant.
We needed a score that was going to really bring out the character within, and Simon has that kind of, dare I say, eccentric character as a composer that really related to the subject matter of the film and the people and the creatures and the landscape within it.
It wasn't just an expedition where they went there and left. They went and did lots of experiments. It was partly a nature film. It was partly the film was a massive collage of discovering the wildlife.
Of course, they'd not seen things like penguins before. So Gaumont, who sponsored the film, asked very specifically for penguins, and my God, we have them.
We'd never seen penguins in the beginning of the 20th century. We didn't know really what a penguin looked like. So Herbert Ponting spent a lot of time filming penguins, hence there's quite a lot of penguins in the film. How do you score a penguin?
The score is really important to how to sell a 2-hour-long non-fiction film where there's a lot of penguins and a lot of ice and not much drama. So you're looking for a musician who can bring out the drama and the humour of the penguins and the ice. And this is quite a tall order, really, when you think about how usually fiction films are have a narrative and have characters and have all sorts of layers of meaning and intrigue and literally drama.
Herbert Ponting's original material that he shot in Antarctica wasn't edited into The Great White Silence until sometime later, in fact in 1924. Prior to that, he had used segments of the film in a lecture that he did some 2,000 times. He then cut it together as a story, and he added in things like maps and plans and titles to tell you what was going on. Beautiful colours. BFI acquired The Great White Silence back in the 40s when the BFI archive was still quite young. We acquired Herbert Ponting's original camera negatives, which were the negatives that came out of the camera that he shot at the Antarctic. But we had no print, finished version to tell us what his film, The Great White Silence of 1924, should have looked like. So we had to reconstruct this from the original camera negatives with his notes. There was no script, so it was not easy.
It really was stretching me musically because I was just completely confounded sometimes. You know, really, how do you fill an 8-minute gap when there are two seals trying to get their pup in and out of water and stop it getting crushed by icebergs and things, you know, and they're just being seals. What do you do for 8 minutes? What works? You just have to keep thinking and trying things out. As I said, I didn't want to go down the path of recreating what was on the screen. So during this process, we discovered that we could do like Foley sounds, false Foleys, which is something we were going to talk about, where we try to make sounds which go with the picture, and you think they're probably the sounds from the picture you're looking at, but they're not. I was in Kyoto with a friend of mine, and we were backstage at a concert he'd just given, and big silk curtains, so I've got a tape recorder with a microphone on it, and I go zzz. Great sound, never used it, never been able to use this sound at all, but it's a lovely sound, and I realised it sounded quite like wind, really. A sound I could really manipulate using a little bit of stuff on the Mac. We did actually have a few bits of luck with sound, which were remarkable. For instance, the bell from the ship Terra Nova. Somebody said one day, Bryony said one day, she said, "Oh, we've got the bell." And I went, "The bell, the bell? What are you talking about?" She said, "The bell from the ship that took Captain Scott to the Antarctic." I didn't know. It's at the Polar Institute, which is in Cambridge, and they've been very helpful. And so we went to record the sound of the bell. But this bell is also unbelievably loud, and I had to record it from literally 2 floors up. I had to go right up the stairs because she would go ding, 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 ding. Whoa, and my microphone's going.
What was most exciting about what Simon Fisher Turner came up with was the conception of trying to connect with the audience through real artefacts, real sound artefacts. So he had some silence from the hut.
This is a stereo recording inside Captain Scott's hut. Terra Nova.
It was all very exciting, and finding the original gramophone records where you see on the boat where they're dancing to a gramophone record. All this kind of thing can connect the audience with something tangible, something real.
Another thing about silence is something which we did which was rather nice. On Remembrance Day, we recorded silence in the recording studio as well. We'll be watching the Cenotaph Memorial on television, and we just recorded the studio completely quiet. All the microphones turned up, but we recorded nothing, nobody making a noise at all. And so when the film goes silent, when they get to the South Pole and you realise they've got there and they've been beaten, the music goes off and you have a Remembrance Day silence, which again seemed to make sense to me, sort of aesthetically. You know, they were Navy people, they were Navy personnel, they died. This is a silence, it's not just any old silence, it's millions of people around the world actually being quiet at the same time. And those kind of things I felt were important, I must admit.
When Herbert Ponting was making this record of the expedition, Obviously he couldn't go on the final race to the pole, you know, this was a job for the experts. He was also 45 at the time, and it would have been distinctly inappropriate for him to try and lug a camera behind people who were making one of the most difficult journeys ever undertaken by human beings. So what he did instead, which is incredibly clever, he was a smart man, Ponting, was to show kind of almost a staging or reconstruction or pre-construction of how Scott and the polar team would be managing the journey. These were staged, these were set up, but what is really interesting and a little spooky about this staging is that it's exactly the same guys who ended up in the tent with Scott. Now, he had not chosen the polar party before this, although he may have had it in his mind, but you have exactly the same guys. So you've got Wilson and Bowers and Edgar Evans and Scott. The only one who's not there is Captain Oates, and you can see how comfortable they are together in the tent. So you can see, I think, how they would have got on with each other, which was just as well, because they were out there for months and months and in this tiny little tent together. And that was the same tent that ended up being their tomb.
I'd heard somehow, I can't remember how, maybe Bryony Dixon told me that there had been a memorial service at St Paul's Cathedral, February the 14th, the year after they were all discovered dead. And so I wanted to know what was in the service, in case we could extract some of that. I got an email on a Friday night with 6 or 7 pages of the original manuscript of the memorial service, which confirmed that they sang hymns, there was poetry, and there was, what was in the service, which immediately meant we could use some of that.
Earth's joys grow dim.
We used Abide With Me, which is a very famous hymn, and I, of course, I didn't really know what it was about, so then you go, Abide With Me, oh, that's perfectly good, because it's about exactly what happened, and it's about bravery and all sorts of things, and about faith. And it's very poignant, which is why it was used for the service, and why we had to use it. It's difficult because you know the story, you know the end of, we all know what happens in the story, so without being too without milking the story too much, we just tried to be as pure as possible, I suppose. Emotional, but not over-emotional, which was actually something which we had to think about all the time, I think.